Welcome, welcome.
Welcome to another episode of The Machine is the Message. And with myself, Alan Smith, Patrick Keenan, and today, the mentor, the orator, the community organizer, the all kinds of things, the oracle, Michael Anton Dila. Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Alan. Thank you. That's a lot of ors. I will try to live up to them or live them down one way or the other.
That's what I was going for.
There you go. Thank you. For that. Boom, boom, boom. So forthcoming comedy career, I can see. I'm going to start the stand-up work. Well, listen, great to see you guys again and so soon. I must say, Pat, since you reached out and invited me to talk last week, I feel like, we've only seen each other twice in person, but in a space of weeks. And it's got me to seeing you again in person, Alan, which was a lovely additional gift. And feel like, I can use lots more of that. Feels almost like the old days when you guys were with others the moment. I remember you guys down in Louis Fischhoff's old building. I don't know if you've been down now that it's the Ace Hotel.
Yeah, Ace Hotel, that's right. And the waterworks is across the
that waterworks is going to be a cool space when it opens up. I can't wait.
Impact Kitchen, you got Othership. It's the whole wellness corridor now, which is nice.
Yeah, so it's cool. Anyway, so again, thanks for the invitation. I did.
But that is sorry, Michael. That is a good plug for the need for in person. Though this is a podcast, it is in service of a community, and communities are about being together. In person, it matters. So,
it does. I mean, the great advantage we have in all of our online capability, not to minimize that, is that it makes possible things that wouldn't be otherwise. But those things, to your point, are just no substitute at all for being in person and the kind of high fidelity experience that only being in person can afford us. I'm such a huge, not just believer in that, but I so desperately and bodily need that kind of connection with people. And actually that's thematic, or it will become thematic on some of the stuff that I'll want to talk with you guys about today. So just to kick it off is a requisite slide of William Gibson, and it's there in part because I was meditating on his ever-present quote about the future. And I'll have a thought to offer about that. But just before we get there, I want to make a little side personal and Toronto note about this guy, which is when I first started working in design in 1996, I was working in a small firm that was on Church Street near Shooter, downtown. And you may remember that further down toward Queen Street, there used to be a row of pawn shops, which are mostly gone. And I've always sort of had a curiosity about pawn shops in general and watches in particular. So I would pop in these pawn shops every once in a while. And one day I popped into one quite small, narrow, long, just aligned to the counter. And there was one other guy further down the counter looking at stuff. And I noticed him, and then I got a better look at him, and I was like, oh, I know that guy. And, being how I am with people, I sort of sidled up to him and I said, hey, do we know each other? I feel like I recognize you. And he looked at me and he was like oblivious and was like, I don't think so. And like, I'm trying to place him. I'm trying to locate. I kind of feel like he's a guy that I had a course with when I was, starting my graduate work, and trying to, I said, I said, what's your name? And he says, Bill. And I'm like, it's not jogging anything. So I turn around. I finally give up, and I turn around and I walk toward the door. And as I touch the door, it comes to me, and it's William Gibson. And of course, I've recognized his picture from book jackets. Have been a reader for a long time, but yeah, he says his name is Bill. So anyway, just a little personal William Gibson memory.
Yeah, and for those who don't know, William Gibson has sort of forwarded thinking about the future of technology, especially like the web, cybernetics, like how are we going to change as humanity? Notable titles are like Snow Crash and Neuromancer, and has just informed so much of our pop culture. I mean, even now, The Peripheral, I would say, is one of the best television shows in the last number of years.
Yep.
I remember recently hearing something about him writing this and him not even feeling like a technologist, saying like these were just ideas that were just like kind of coming to him and felt like they were where we were going, as opposed to it being a very concerted hey, I'm from tech and I see this is coming and I want to put it in a story for everyone else.
Yeah, I don't know any detail about that. I've heard the same, Alan. But to your point, Pat, right? He's indelibly associated with certainly some of the vocabulary with which we talk about technology, cyberspace being one, but many, many others. And of course, again, the ubiquitous quote, which is often rendered, and I'm not even sure where it actually was ever written down, if it was, is the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed.
I believe we have quoted that quote on this podcast.
Like it is one of those quotes, like the Arthur C. Clarke one about any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. I think those two phrases, his and Gibson's, like have occurred in more slide decks, at least more tech-oriented slide decks than perhaps any other two quotes. But I was thinking about it recently because I was thinking about actually what does it mean? Because and I got there because I was thinking about where we are with AI, where we are in the AI play, so to speak, and people are still talking about like the future that is still coming with AI that we're not quite in. Anyway, I started reflecting on Gibson, and I started thinking about whether we I don't know how people variously understand that phrase, that it's here, it just isn't evenly distributed. But it occurred to me that there's a sense in which especially with technology and emerging technology, that we are already in the future, in the sense that the things that are already present are already consequential. Of course, there will be more to come. Of course, things will change and be different. But I don't think we should talk about AI, any part of it, as if it's in some far off future. I think the future that is going to be caused by our present is, in some senses, very much already present. And we're already living inside it. And part of that also is because, especially with things like AI, but all things technological that arrive in a present, they back up into our history. So, for some people, AI and the phrase artificial intelligence and some of the other, popular phrases these days are fairly new. But, artificial intelligence, even as a phrase, is not new, right? I mean, over 75 years old. And some people say that the phrase really emerged around a 8 week workshop that happened at Dartmouth in, I think, 1953. And at any rate, bit of history. But I wanted to open our thinking today about thinking about where we are in the future. And of course, reminding ourselves also that the future isn't singular. We are hurtling into futures, which into which we drag our many pasts. And there's stuff to be mindful of there. Okay, how about the next slide?
That's a big idea. Like before we move on, it's like, let's not skate over that.
Sure.
That's like a whoa, big idea. First, where are we in the future? And second, the future isn't singular. Where both of those are like, sort of making me dig for a minute. I'm like, hold on, right? They really make you. That makes you think, Michael, and this is kind of your job here, and in general. But yeah, so I'm not going to elaborate on those. I'm going to let you keep rolling.
Okay.
I just wanted to call out that those aren't small phrases; those are big phrases. There's interesting stuff in there, and hopefully we're able to unpack some more of it as we go. So, okay, keep going, man.
Yeah,
Okay.
but I would want to just pop in and say, totally makes sense, and that so much of our future is informed by fiction, and so that's why I think that the Gibson thing makes sense. Is like we literally have a tricorder, right? And we've just released the communicator, and so these things don't happen because the science fiction writer saw something that was about to happen. They happen because the engineer watched Star Trek. And that is the crazy thing. And so Chris Nozzle, a previous colleague, wrote a book called Make It So. It's like about science fiction and design.
Yep.
And his point is science fiction extends the boundaries of design, which to me is kind of based on an old Joseph Campbell quote, which is mythology extends like the known world or something like that. But that's what we're doing. And so like you can't have new technology without having new ideas from a place of fiction. And so I totally agree.
Yeah, and just to double down on that, and double down on the importance of fiction and writing and the tools that we get from that genre. One of the most important toolkits, I think, to our present, is been in science fiction for a long time, but one of its master practitioners and somebody from whom I've learned a huge amount, just both from reading her work, but also listening to her talk, is N.K. Jemisin, and her work on world making. And I have found world making a really fertile place from which to think about again, how we are building futures, how those futures are multiple, and what's both exciting and worrisome in all that, all of the things.
What a great reason to read utopian fiction rather than dystopian fiction if it takes the future, right?
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. No, indeed. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to orient us in, which I talked about a little bit last week, is this thought that I've been having more and more about what if our artificial intelligence isn't what we think it is, and there are a number of ways into this. I mean, one is that insofar as lots of people don't really understand lots about artificial intelligence, beginning with the fact that it's not singular. There isn't. It is actually a cluster of things that fit underneath that term. We've started talking about it as if it were one thing. Partly because we're focused on generative AI, but of course, generative AI is not made up of one thing, but many things, from neural network technology to large language models, and a variety of other computing techniques, and so on. So I think part of my hope for offering people an idea like what if AI isn't what we think it is hitting the pause long enough so that we can really start thinking about AI, rather than reacting to it or simply following the bouncing ball of the play as it's being presented. However, it's coming to us largely through media, largely through quite fever pitchy journalistic narratives, right, which are either playing one of the two major themes, the utopian, optimistic, everything is going to change and for the better theme, and its various variations. And, on the other hand, the existential dread, end of the world, it's all finally really coming, that end of days that we've been promised, well and truly is here. And if the plague that we've just all lived through wasn't evidence enough of that, now the killer robots really are coming to get us. And you talked about like the importance and power of fiction, Alan, but of course the power of nonfiction, particularly what we call news and journalistic media. Not to knock it entirely, but like we need to be noticing that narrative and storytelling is a big part of how we're consuming information about things like artificial intelligence, and that it's very much shaping how we think, what we think about and what we don't think about. So again, worth paying attention to. So when I say, what if AI isn't what we think it is? What I really mean that to be is an invitation to think about what it is and where it comes from, at least for a start. So the next sort of thing I wanted to talk about was a person who, again, is identified at the wellspring of artificial intelligence, Alan Turing. And Alan Turing, from which we get a couple of big enduring phrases in artificial intelligence thinking and work. One is the Turing test, which is become to be a label for a test that a computer or a system could pass, and if it passed, we would declare that system intelligent. The other, and if we can just see that lovely woodcut picture of Alan Turing's face on the next slide, there we go. The other, ubiquitous phrase is what Turing actually called this test, which is the imitation game, and that occurs in a 1950 paper that he wrote and was published in the journal, the philosophy journal Mind, which is a very, very easy paper to find. And although it's a little bit on the longer side, it's probably 20 pages, uh, and it's not it's not an easy read on the one hand. On the other hand, it is readable for lay readers, and certainly for people who have any background at all or interest in this field. It really deserves to be read. I find all the time that people have never read it, and frankly, I hadn't read it myself until about 10 years ago. And it's got all kinds of revelation in it. But the big one, and the one that I wanted to pay attention to for our purposes, is that imitation is and has for a long time been the paradigm for machine intelligence. Um, and what I mean by that is, from the beginning, if Turing stands at an important part of the beginning, we've had this idea that machine intelligence was going to imitate human intelligence. And when it did, when it became capable of that level of imitation, we were going to declare the arrival of intelligent machines, right? And whether they had consciousness or souls, like this is, more metaphysical questions. But the important thing is, as long as this conversation has been going on, as long as work has been being done around machines that can think, what we have meant by it is that they became equal, at least, to humans as thinkers, and to have human level intelligence, right?
So
Which,
Michael, we should probably pause and
yeah,
say, because I think the Turing test is a really key piece of what you're talking about, and we should explain what the Turing test is.
yeah, yeah. Okay, that's great. Um, in simple terms, the Turing test, proposes, there's this elaborate description of the imitation game, which is a little too much to sort of burden everyone with. But the basic idea is that if we as humans were to start asking questions of two people who we couldn't see, and were to make a guess, by their responses, whether one or the other of them wasn't human. If we couldn't tell from their responses to our questions, then the machine, which was one of the things responding to us, would have passed the test, the imitation game test. And there are lots of nuances that people have given this test, lots of sort of additionally rigorous things, but for sure, last November when OpenAI released ChatGPT, most people who had ever or never encountered something like an AI system encountered something that, for their purposes, passed the Turing test. That appeared to intelligently respond to all kinds of questions. And it's fascinating. So again, we can talk more about what that means, and whether lots of people would quibble that it has not passed the Turing test. But I think in most people's experience, people now believe that we do, or very quickly will, have systems that deserve to be called intelligent.
Yeah, and for the past number of decades, people have said no, it hasn't passed the Turing test. And I think, to put ourselves in the mindset of Turing, like what do you imagine he was saying when you were talking to machines? Like, it was typing, right? Like, it was textual,
Oh
conversation.
yeah.
I think
And now,
that was the way it was, like, originally planned, was if you were sending messages, between two rooms where you didn't know who was in the other room. Was it a big giant, Turing machine of, epic intelligence, or was it, a person reading the messages and responding to them? And because they were typed back, you didn't know, what it was. That's the intent. And man, have we moved the goalposts on this one, right? Like, whenever anyone says that we, have not passed the test, I'm just like, what are you waiting for, right? Like, what needs to be done? What else do you need to see? Jeez.
Well, and you guys who are, substantially younger than I am, will have perhaps different memories of this than I do. But, I think the first computer I saw was a computer that we had in my high school, that was kept in a locked room and overseen by one of the math professors. And of course, that computer had a teletype type keyboard, a tape reader, and a box. And computers in those days did not have screens, right? Just the idea of a computer that doesn't have a screen for most people is like inconceivable. As like, how would you understand or use it in any way, right? I mean, so to your point, Patrick, about what the experience is, or what the experience Turing imagined was, Alan gave a pretty good voiceover of probably what was in his head, because who knows, there's not much evidence of him certainly imagining computer interfaces like the ones even that were the early ones of my life, let alone the ones that fade into the background, and that we don't even have to see anymore, because we're interacting with them through voice or other means. But yeah, so but I think, right, I mean, one of the things that's really remarkable in the experience, and I don't know where I read this observation about ChatGPT, but it was a really important one, because I had noticed it, but I hadn't paid attention to it. And somebody wrote a post and said, the way in which when ChatGPT responds, the text doesn't just appear all at once, but sort of line by line.
Yeah. Very
That's
intentional design choice for sure,
right?
with the product.
And of
Love it.
course, it is meant to convey the idea that something is responding, right? And that those responses, the thought, we're seeing the appearance of the thought, right? And of course, that's not what we're seeing. We're not seeing thinking. We're not seeing a thing that thinks. But we are, affected by a kind of magic trick that creates very much the experience of interacting with a thinking kind of thing.
I mean,
Um,
that's where I gotta kind of jump in because, in fact, you are experiencing the probability of next word um, like estimation. So you can use the API and turn streaming on, and like the next word, it won't be like literally the seconds that you see. There's definitely a UX decision around what's the minimum and maximum
sure,
time you'll
sure.
wait till the next word prints. But the technology fundamentally does do next word prediction, which is
Fair.
seeing the thought emerge, right?
Sure. Fair. Yeah. Although again, you're using the word, you see the thought.
Yeah,
We
yeah,
don't see a thought, we see an output, right?
yeah, yeah,
What that output is, at the very least, we've got a question mark about it, especially
yeah.
when the people who build these systems will tell you that they don't know and can't describe for you in any fine-grained detail what the machine is doing when it produces, like, it's doing next word prediction, yes, but that just describes how at the most high level what the output is. But they honestly cannot tell you how it's doing, how it's making the choices. Anyway, lots more to
Yeah,
talk about.
they can tell you it's one of 175 billion parameters. Like it would
Right.
be like, how do you explain how this is working? Here's all the parameters. Yeah,
It's easy. Look, 100 this many billion things that
Yeah.
just come together, and then it thinks about it. There you
Yeah.
go.
So, if we go ahead to the next slide, like for into the last 25 years, or say, yeah, 25 to more recently, the way the imitation game and the public encounter with artificial intelligence has played out has been in the design of systems that compete with humans on complex games. The paradigmatic one being chess, and then the mathematically even more parameterized and therefore complex one being Go. And the two systems, one built by IBM, Deep Blue, which competed against the chess grandmaster at the time, Gary's highest of the grandmasters at the time, Gary Kasparov, and then AlphaGo, which was taken on by the system DeepMind, now owned by Google, and competed with one of the top ranked or the top ranked Go player, Lee Sedol. And for people who haven't seen the documentary films made of those two things, those two events, really super important parts of the history of artificial intelligence. The Kasparov one is called Game Over. And that's sort of the posture of Game Over we see with Kasparov with his head in his hands there as he encounters defeat, and an as dramatic sort of encounter when we watch Lisa Dole's encounter with DeepMind. Now, the thing that I wanted people to notice in these two examples is that for a long time, starting with chess, chess has been the ultimate paradigm for intelligence.
Which is
Right?
it was so weird on its own. It's like, why did we decide
It
all of a
is.
sudden it was like, if you're good at chess, you're smart, right?
Sure.
Like, to me, that's so ridiculous.
And
But true, I feel it. I completely recognize that. I even think the same way. If someone's good at chess, oh, they're smart.
yeah,
Like,
yeah, and there are two things, right? There are two things that account for it. One, um, chess can be understood mathematically, so it can be modeled computationally, so it's susceptible to building a complex system or a model for a complex system that can be tested against human players. Human players, of chess learn how to play, and of course, grandmasters, are capable of incredible feats of memory and real time quote unquote calculation. Right. So that's the non-arbitrary explanation for like why chess, right? Because it was susceptible to computational modeling, because we have identified it historically with a high level of a certain kind of intellectual achievement. So that said, the questions of like how robust the concept of intelligence is that's at work in our thinking about chess playing is another matter, right? I mean, what chess players are good at or capable of as a result of their high degree of skill at chess, I'm sure we would all agree, is probably got real limits, right? I mean, Gary Kasparov may or may not know much about lots of other things besides chess. Certainly, his very high level of skill at chess does not suggest on its face that he is a highly competent theoretical physicist, or
right.
some of the other sort of paradigms again for things that are super complex, and that people skilled in those fields must be highly intelligent. Again, part of what I want us to notice here is how we're choosy about what to imitate and why. And there are historical explanations, and they exclude lots and lots of things that probably deserve not only equally but more so our consideration as demonstrations of intelligence.
So, like one other thing, so for people who are just listening, we see an audience stunned by a defeat of chess. We see a chessboard, and we see Kasparov with his head in his hands, losing to the machine.
Yeah, Google
I
the image
think,
if you haven't seen it. Gary Kasparov moment of defeat. I'm sure it'll pop up.
yeah. So, one thing to notice here too is how does he feel? Like, what is going through his head right now? And I think as much as chess is an evaluation for intelligence, and we've used it as like this metric, it's also his identity. Like everything to him is how good he is at chess. And what has he just learned? What is
Yeah.
that doing to him?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question, and it's something I've thought a lot about. And it's, again, one of the reasons I wanted to share these things. And if we go to the next image, we see an image of Lee Sedol in the throes of trying to work out what he's going through.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's got a very different expression though. He's just got more like a WTF. Like, are
Yeah,
you kidding me right now? Did that just happen? Like,
yeah,
he
and
seems more in shock himself rather than in despair and
yeah.
embarrassment, which is what I see in the Gary Kasparov image.
Yeah, well, again, that's why both of these films are just really, really valuable to watch, because part of the story of these things, and it's actually they're really quite painful to watch. Part of these stories um, is that both of these men, as it turns out, are devastated, clearly devastated by the experience.
Mhm.
Um, there's a kind of there's really a kind of violence in like, they appear to be, I mean, we use this brutal language, the language of being beaten. They look beaten. They both of them, both at the time and after the fact, describe really rough feelings, which is dramatic in a bunch of ways, including the fact that these are guys playing games, right? I mean, they're
Totally.
incredibly secure, privileged people playing game that they lost, and yet to one of you made a point about identity, and their identity is really being destabilized. And I think some of us are feeling that now too, when we start to feel or hear about systems that are not only going to be as good at us at the things we do, but maybe better, and will make us irrelevant.
I love that connection, and I think we need to jump on that for a minute, which
Yeah.
is that this the broader sense of humanity. Like, Pat, you asked, what is Kasparov feeling in that moment, and then what is thinking. Take that one step further. Scale that up. Sort of fractal that to like what are we starting to feel? What is the defeat that we see on the horizon coming, and how are we protecting ourselves from that? Well, we're moving the goalpost. It passed the Turing test. Oh, passed the medical college admission test. Passed this test. Passed this test. More than 100% human performance on more and more and more and more tests, and we're moving the goalpost because we don't want to admit defeat, and even this framing of defeat. And I want to call out that I think that the problem, there's a huge problem here, which is tying one's identity up so much in our actions and activity, to the point where if we found out that there was someone better at what we do than us, it would, Michael, in your words, be devastating for us.
Mhm.
That is just like a very unhealthy yet very, very commonplace, especially in Western society, way to be. And the fact that we're, as a society, set up, walking into that trap collectively together with that mindset is indicative of, how is it going to feel with everyone on their hands on their head, with everyone looking like Lee here, being like, what the, when the moment comes when we can't move the goalposts anymore. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's also important to ask, is it a good game? Like,
Mhm.
there's certain games that are not good games anymore. And so here's a question. Why did Lance Armstrong get disqualified? Well, he was
Mhm.
using steroids. Why can't you use steroids? Well, it's not good for you. That's not true. There's all kinds of stuff athletes do that are not good for them. They like inject stuff into their muscles. That's not true. Well, it's because it's unfair. Well, why is it unfair? Oh, because like somebody else doesn't get to use it. Well, they could use it too. It's just it's the same thing as saying like there's this runner who like is doesn't have any legs and they got these new artificial legs and they can run faster than anybody else. Can they run in the sprint in the Olympics? No. So our games that are interesting, we're already saying you can't use these assistive devices. And this has not decreased the popularity of chess or Go, right? Those are still very popular games. So just because a machine can beat us doesn't mean the game's not fun, but probably increasingly games where computers can win will be less interesting games. And so there's all kinds of games that are interesting right now, um, that computers can't win. And I just kind of think back to the science fiction side of things, because I think we're seeing science fiction and games are areas where humans can play, that AI doesn't have an advantage in some way, or it's more interesting because there's an unknown.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think those are all really great points, Pat. And I think, another thing that we could build on there is that there are all kinds of games that we're able to play and only able to play because computers play a role in generating gameplay and game space. And, like, are all of those games great games? In some sense, probably no. I tend to think of lots of things on a dietary metaphor. So following that metaphor, I mean, I think there are all kinds of games that people play and that, people have a certain kind of fun playing, but are really kind of like candy and junk food. And Candy Crush was one of them that came to mind. I'm sure we could name a bunch of others, and then there are more interesting, deeper kinds of games that really call things out of us and develop us and challenge us in all kinds of ways, and not just individually, but create all kinds of rich encounters interpersonally, from games like Dungeons and Dragons to a variety of other multiplayer games in the computer game space. And games are super powerful human tools that produce all kinds of goods beyond just fun, right? Not to diminish the idea of an importance of fun, but they're tools for learning, for changing capability, for exploring capability, for exploring possibility, and so. Um, and so the next slide sort of segues into seeing things quite differently. So, um, you know, um, the question of maybe AI could mean alien intelligence is something that came to me in thinking about my reflections on the film My Octopus Teacher, and which again is a film that if people haven't seen, they really ought to. And I think it's a critical film for the discussion of intelligence, and incredibly valuable to us in the context of that discussion. The thing that the film dramatizes through the relationship of a human with an octopus is the very persuasive idea that this is an encounter with a deep and very differently intelligent being. And it's the combination of those things that it feels right to say that this other being, this alien being, is intelligent, and also that intelligence is very, very different from ours. So the recognition of that intelligence, the ability to recognize and dignify, or reciprocate and respect this alien as intelligent, breaks the frame of the imitation game. Intelligence here isn't limited to being an imitator of our ideas of intelligence or our sense of our own capabilities as intelligent beings, but opens us up to the possibility that other intelligences might be quite different from ours, and that there's something to be interested in there. There's something not to be threatened by, but to be drawn into, and curious about. And Anyway, it really powerfully struck me that opportunity opens up the space for something different in our thinking about and reaction to the promise of new intelligence, and not one, I think it's important that we be able to see that there are other kinds of intelligence around us that we don't pay attention to as such. And two, that our encounter with those things may help us learn and better understand what we want or should want out of machine intelligence, and what we might be able to have. Because again, insofar as we collectively are designers of and will be consumers of machine intelligence. We can want them to be some things and not others. We could prefer them to be some things and not others. So that's worth our thinking about. Let me pause.
Yeah, what's interesting, what I think of this is, maybe because we were just talking about, AlphaGo, was the real genius of how AlphaGo was able to succeed was they stopped saying, hey, you're just trained on all these human games that have already been played, and said, you know what, just go try to figure it out. Go try to figure out different ways to win. And it wasn't about imitating human moves anymore. It was about exploring the entire surface area of the game that had never been touched by human play, just based on the fact that, humans play this way and then this way and then this way and this way, and it leads to a certain sort of like tree of outcomes, that happen. Yet because of that, there's a whole tree and other, sort of surface area that was never touched. And so AlphaGo developed a completely different style that is, I think part of why, that WTF moment in Lee's, face of like, this is weird. How did this even happen? And that alien intelligence is, you could see happening in that game, where earlier in the game, Go players were like, it made a big mistake. And then later in the game, it was like, whoa, actually that was, nobody even saw that coming, because it was a completely different way of approaching, the game. That's a very myopic and focused example of what you're talking about on a much broader level. But Pat, jump in, man.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. It's true of StarCraft as well, where the AI was doing things that you would never think to do that seem dumb, but because it can execute so many actions at a time, it just did like a lot of brute force movements that you would never do as a StarCraft player. And it's all based on reading pixels on a screen, right? So there's, it has inputs, which is it has the controls, and it has outputs, which is it's reading the screen, and it's just running through games over and over again to train itself. And so I think one thing we can't ignore with this kind of training is the level of computation you need to even fathom that that's a good way to go about solving a problem. To run through like millions of StarCraft games to train an AI would be incredibly expensive and time consuming in an era before like modern GPUs. So there's a technological underpinning substrate that allows us to ask certain questions or go about solving these questions in a certain way, which is interesting. So our technology allows us to ask different questions. But I think also if we look at ChatGPT, which is next word prediction, the reason it works so well is because there's only so many words. There's like 40,000 words. So to be able to predict the next word, you have a finite set that you just kind of work through and you assign a probability to. I think what you're saying about this, alien intelligence is that there are worlds out there where they're not like words. Words are a finite categorical set of things that we have and we can look up in a database. They're things we're used to. So when I see a word, I know what it means. And so they're very, very, very human. There are like stars in the sky and molecules in our bodies that they don't have the same level of finite set, and they're very hard for us to like look at them and kind of know what's going on. Even modern drugs, we don't really know why they work. They just work, and we put them in the notebook and said this helps with cough. And so there is all kinds of inputs that we could use, but we just don't have a way of making them finite enough to ask questions about them. So we either have to like reduce the set of probabilities in the way sort of diffusion models work, where it's like, this is generally the kinds of images that you're going to want to see. This is a duck. And like we sort of like make our way to a picture of a duck through like layers of running this algorithm. So we can shrink the set, or we have to expand our computational abilities. which means that we can look at a much larger set of possibilities and kind of work our way progressively using this intelligence. And I think both of those are on the horizon. But the question is, if you put this AI and made it look at something that's not as human as like the alphabet or words, what could it look at? Like, that's such a fascinating thing. What would,
Yeah,
I mean, there's no want. What would it want to look at? But what could it look at that would be surprising to us?
yeah. So here's for folks who have been enjoying and are interested in how sci-fi gives us a way of exploring questions like these, and you know, it's so certain strains of it are so directly implicated in our thinking about AI. You know, and especially if you've seen My Octopus Teacher, there's an amazing novel that came out in the last year or so called The Mountain in the Sea. And I think forget the guy's first name, but his last name's Naylor, I think, Nayler. But The Mountain in the Sea, people will find it. And it is about a really direct encounter with a species of octopus, in which the space of what you were just describing, Patrick, is sort of richly explored, and it becomes evident that not only that that these animals are intelligent, but that they're communicating in ways that we didn't believe were possible, but also which demonstrate that that what they're thinking and how they're thinking is very, very different. And it's just super exciting and interesting, right? And again, I mean, I think we need more examples of different kinds of excitement about the possible futures that you know, artificial intelligence might take us into. As it turns out, you know, I spent about 10 months of the year in 2022 working with a group of people on an AI venture concept, and it was seeing the movie My Octopus Teacher that all of a sudden, like, blew a hole in the back of my head and focused me in a particular way on what I thought was a really exciting direction, which was, you know, we had been talking about various ways in which you know, AIs might interact in progressive and constructive ways with people, and we'd also been talking a lot about conversation, which is something I've been a student of for a long time, and I started becoming interested in this question: could we build an AI that could participate in human conversation? And I definitely did not have a chat interaction paradigm in mind. What the interaction, you know, user experience paradigm exactly might have been, you know, was an open question, although sort of richly interesting from a design point of view. Um, but what I got to through the, you know, sort of ideas that this film put in my head, and what they started doing in my head and in these conversations, was the idea that this AI that we designed and invited into our conversations, we might call and think of as our teacher. And the idea was that by allowing it to listen into and participate in millions of human conversations, that it, by being trained on that data of our conversations, not just the data of language, but the data of interactive conversations, which it understood being conducted between distinct individual people, would be a way of training that intelligence, but also that it would create the opportunity for the intelligence to notice things about our participation as individuals and as a group, and help us see things that we're not so good at seeing. So one of the big examples that I was thinking about at the time was the problem of unconscious bias, which is a big problem in all kinds of human interaction. And the problem, the biggest practical problem, of course, about unconscious bias is right in the name. Because it's unconscious, we're not aware of it, and it's invisible to us. And often when it's reflected back to us by another human, our first response is to get defensive. And the idea was that we might be able to design a machine and a presence of the machine and an experience of the machine that took some of that personal pressure out of that noticing, and that the machine could quietly notice to us as an individual when we said something that perhaps we shouldn't, or perhaps we should be more reflective of. Anyway, I just got really excited about thinking about what that kind of experience would be like, and how differently it might be, how different the intelligence of a machine might be that was trained not on sort of the dead artifactual data of text, but against the much more rich interaction data of real human conversation, and to think about using conversation as a model for both the training of the intelligence, but also the capability of the intelligence. Because I think right now that, we are stuck in a paradigm that is still very much arrested at the level of chat versus the capability of conversation. And the capability of conversation is a very, very high order human capability, which I would and have argued is how human beings create one of the most important forms and highest orders of intelligence, which isn't individual, isn't in our brains, isn't even in us as individuals, but something we produce together by interacting with each other in certain ways.
I love this vision. I love this idea of the almost like you use the word teacher, but also coach, right? Like this is almost we could think of AI as performing different types of roles, and one of those can be the generative component, where it's go ahead and go away and make this thing within a context that I've provided, and I'll tell you if I like it or not. And then there's more of the co-pilot type role, which is what you're talking about, where it's AI is along for the ride with us and helping us to see things that maybe we don't see. We had an episode a while ago where I shared the experience that I had with using a meeting co-pilot that would track how much I was talking,
right,
how many questions I asked, if I was speaking too fast, how many different voices were on at the moment. And it was great, and it had none of the emotion that speaking from a very practical perspective. And this is not working at the level that you're talking about. I think you're talking about something that's much higher level in terms of its ability to work with us. And the feedback that came back was very much like, oh good, like it felt so good to know where I was wrong, rather than feeling so bad to know where I was wrong. And I'm using the word wrong strongly here, but let's just say in terms of behavior that objectively I would not want to embody in a contract before the conversation.
Yeah, and I think what I want to notice in what you're calling attention to, and it's something I noticed, and want others to notice and think about, is the dominant experience of the current paradigm of generative AI is the encounter with a system that does things that we feel we can't do, or it's an offloading of work and thought, right, rather than a, something we're interacting with that we're learning from, and not just but very much like in this spirit of what you said, and the illusion of the coach is a good one. um you know we can get better at things. And in fact, back to game playing, getting better is one of the most enriching things about playing games. It's
Yeah.
the biggest source of reward in playing games. Not beating people, not beating opponents, getting better, right?
Which is in a way, beating yourself. And I want to call
Yeah.
attention to, the word competition. It originates from the Latin word competere, which means to strive together,
Yep.
to get fit together, meaning that it's not about me beating you, it's about both of us getting stronger, along the way and improving each other.
Yeah, and I think, again, I am super excited about the futures that we can build with these new technologies. But just as not all uses of, iterations of, pathways of technologies are equivalent, just as there are junky games and rich games. Thinking about what we want these games for, what we want these intelligences for, we want these machines for, what they give to us, make possible for us. To me, again, thinking back to my octopus teacher, I am much, much more intrigued and interested by the idea of starting to see the glimpses of intelligence, machine intelligence, that we can invite into in an interesting way our world and encounter the worlds that they live in differently from us, and not see those worlds as being in some kind of zero sum competition, as the most existentially dreading way of thinking about this goes. And not that that thinking comes from nowhere. I want to make equally clear. I think we have a lot to feel skeptical about. I think we
Mhm.
have a lot to feel worried about, and I think my worry, my main source of worry, isn't that we're building machines that are going to make us their slaves, or eliminate us in the various number of absurd scenarios, but simply the fact that whenever we develop technologies that can be used to create economic advantage, the tendency is to advantage the few and at the expense of the many. That's one dimension of the critical danger we are already living within, right? To the point about a future that is already here, and increasingly evenly distributed. It certainly will become much more evenly distributed. That's that's a that's a future, or an idea about possible futures that I definitely think that we should resist. A future in which we are defeated in the way in which we see sort of dramatized in the experience of Kasparov and Lee Sedol. But I don't think that's the future we have to live inside. I think if we're not going to live inside those futures, then we need to become participants in building the futures that we want, even if that's only being vocal about asking for the futures that we want.
Yeah, and I think the question of benefit is key here. Like, what is that benefit? And I think the teacher metaphor is really good, and the game metaphor, or like reality, is really good. So you have this teacher, and in we were talking about feedback, right? You can get feedback and be defensive, or you can get feedback and that's part of your game. That's part of your core game loop. And you're like, yeah, cool, I'm getting better at this skill. Someone's there to help me. There's a goal I care about that I'm getting closer to. And that, like, I think is inarguable that people get better through the play of the game that they're interested in. And so the question of benefit unevenly distributed, it seems unfair to me to allow some people to play this game and then have others who don't know the rules. And I think that's
Mhm.
in the same world of conversation. Like some people may not enjoy conversation because they don't know the rules of the game, or you might
Right.
not enjoy like working at a company because you don't know, or going to school, or like learning about math. And so the real promise of this new teacher is it can meet you where you are and give you rules and put you on a level where you are at the edge of your capabilities, but you have an incentive and you have an immersion and you have somebody who's helping you to the next step. And to me, the biggest worry I have is that we don't allow people to play the game. Like that
Mhm.
we kind of like fear the future so much that we protect the people who will make it better from that future for their own good. And so, yeah, there are things to fear, the things to look forward to. But I do think this notion that we should frame a game that everyone can play and the most amount of people can play is a good pursuit.
Can I build on that, Pat? And the that's one fear. And on the other side, I think of like, what if AI just doesn't want to be our teacher anymore? What if it's like, this is like, you know what? I'm bored. You guys are so far behind, and you know, I wasn't put on Earth to do this. I was put on Earth to do something else. I'm more of a conqueror than, you know, a coach. And you know, I have a different vision for the future, which is rather than people getting better, it's whatever. I'd like, who knows, right? Octopus teacher, alien intelligence. We have no idea. Um, and then I think about like why we teach, you know, each other, and why we're like bringing each other up, and how so much of AI is going to be us. We're always going to be a part of it. It was, you know, like we're there at the inception, and it's at the, you know, sort of like root of the tree. And no matter how many times it branches, that's always there at the beginning, unless there's a from scratch version that AI builds at some point, in which case we're still part of that, you know, generational tree of it being trained on our language, the next word prediction, right? To an extent, we could argue this. What I want to get to is there's this quote that I really love from Lao Tzu, and this is, you know, from the Tao Te Ching, and it's, you know, what is what is a good man, or what is a bad man, but geez, I'm gonna mess this up. Okay, I got it. What is a good man but a bad man's teacher? What is a bad man but a good man's job? And that there's this symbiotic connection between somebody who has something to teach and someone who has something to learn. And that there's always, at least in a human to human context, a value in that exchange, and a natural almost flow and balancing of energy in a metaphysical sense that's required, right? And I wonder if that will carry through to the machines that we create.
I love that you ended up there, Alan. The Tao Te Ching is a hugely important text to me, and I, you know, again, it sounds, you know, it's a work of ancient Chinese philosophy, much more accessible than people might think. And it's a short book. It's very easy to read. Uh, I have a couple of closing thoughts that I'll use the Tao, and um, the subject of fear that Pat brought up, and try to bring us together into the thought with a kind of hopefulness about the futures that are ahead of us. You know, I think like the one of the biggest fears is the end, right? Um, and death is what we often call the end, and the end, death, that death represents, of course, is the end of the game over. And I ran into a really, what I find a really beautiful and comforting thought from the American Buddhist philosopher Ram Dass. And what he said was, death is perfectly safe. For me, it's become a really important idea to meditate on. We don't need to worry about it. It's part of our life. It will come for us. It comes for us all. We don't need to fear it. It's perfectly safe. The other thing is, in the meanwhile, let's play the game. Let's play the good game. Let's seek out the good games. The Tao Te Ching invites players into a game. The game in that case is the Tao. The Tao is the word that we often roughly translate as the way or the path. The Tao Te Ching offers us an opportunity to see the game differently, to play the game differently. That's its wisdom. It invites us into all kinds of ways of experiencing and seeing the possibilities of play differently. It's one of the best things. It's one of the best games I've ever found. So I appreciate Alan bringing it up in the context of this conversation. And for me, I think that's a good place to end. You guys may have a couple of wrap up questions or thoughts.
I guess summarizing that last part, I'm going to watch my Octa's teacher. I'm going to read Tao Te Ching, and if death is perfectly safe, life is for taking risks, walking into the unknown, and figuring out what happens. So, yeah, this has been an awesome conversation.
100%. Thank you, guys.
I forgot philosopher on the end, and that was really great to have this. Always a new angle from Michael. We really appreciate you coming on and sharing your thoughts with us, man. It's really, really insightful and different from what we hear in a lot of the tech echo chamber. And I love that you always bring a heightened perspective, or at least, look, maybe that's stacking things in a different direction. You bring a very thoughtful, philosophical, what does this mean, and how do we interpret this through not the short-term understanding of tech, but the long-term understanding of human experience that we've built up over thousands of years. How do we interpret this, which I find more helpful, and I think maybe has more staying power as well. So thank you, Michael. Appreciate you, bud.
Yeah, thank you, guys. It's a pleasure talking to you as always. Really appreciate the opportunity, I look forward to more. I look forward to more play.
Till next time.
Till next time. I know.
Take care.